Welcome, Captain Moto here. Thanks for dropping in. Hey, I'm no expert. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. You know, sometimes things look pretty complicated, and you wish you had some clarity. Hey, I try to make it simple. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. Let's dive in. Let's talk about the gain or volume meters that we use when we are recording or mixing inside the DAW. Now, Studio One is my DAW of choice, so I'll be using that for all the demonstrations in this video. But keep in mind, the principles that I am outlining here will apply to any recording environment. However, every DAW seems to configure their meters in a different way. So, once you have a grasp for the principles I'm presenting, you should be able to apply those to the DAW of your choice, whether it be Studio One, Cubase, Pro Tools, Ableton, whatever it is. And I would suggest once you grasp these basic principles, just refer to your manual or the tutorials for your DAW so that you can apply them in your own system. So that's it. As we move forward, I hope this will help you better understand the metering systems within your DAW and ultimately improve your recording and mixing. So, let's move on from there, and please don't forget, I'm no expert. I'm just a guy splaining stuff. Now, the most important tool that you have to evaluate your recordings is your ears. So practice and train your ears. Ears help us with the creative decisions, but the meters help us manage the technical decisions. We need to understand the meters. What do they measure? How to interpret them? And how to use them? Now, the primary focus of this video is gain, volume, and loudness meters. However, I'll also touch on gain staging, recording levels, mixing levels, mastering, and something called LUFS. Let's start with dBs. Here's an explanation. Is a way to express the ratio of two amounts of electrical power, voltage, or sound. Perfectly clear, right? Oh, I doubt it. I'll try to make it simple. Let's move ahead. As I just mentioned, dBs can measure the difference in ratio between electricity or volume of a sound. So, how do we use the term dB? Where did it come from? I'll explain. You may have heard all or some or one or two of these types of dB. There's dBV, there's dBu, dBw, dBm, dBSPL, and more. Here we go. dBVU and dBFS, or full scale. Wow, a lot to digest, but in a few minutes, you'll be an expert on this. Now, all of those terms have some degree of relevance to audio and audio recording. But as we dive deeper into it, you'll see there's only a couple that we use on a regular basis, and I hope to help you understand what they mean and how you use them. But before we go there, stick with me. We need to take a little trip back in history to first understand what is a dB, how did it come about, and how do we use it today. So the term dB really has two components to it. The B, the second part, which is always written in a capital B, refers to a bell, which was a way to evaluate electrical current passing through telephone lines. And the reason it was named a bell was in honor of Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. So that's where the B comes from. It's a unit for measuring electricity. Now, the D, which is always expressed in a small d, indicates a decibel, meaning 1/10 of a bell. So this measurement called a bell was invented, and then so we could better manage that, we divided it by 10, and we came up with a decibel. So that's the dB that we see every day, even though there are a variety types of decibels. So I'm going to touch a little bit on what all those mean and which ones we use and which ones we don't have to be concerned about. But I'm going to use a food analogy that hopefully will help you grasp this. I'm sure you've heard the term, when consuming food, the term of a portion. So let's use, for example, if you're going to eat pizza, you might want a portion of pizza, and that might be a slice. Okay? Now, the same term, portion, may also apply to sugar, as example. And a portion of sugar might be 1 tablespoon. Even though both of those are called a portion, there's no relevance between a tablespoon of sugar and a slice of pizza. And as a matter of fact, what happens if you have an extra large pizza or a small individual pizza? One small pizza might be considered a portion, while one slice of a large pizza is considered a portion. So the reason I use that is to remind you that the term decibels is always relative to a ratio between two things, between two items and what they're calibrated against. You know, just like a spoonful of sugar versus a slice of pizza. A dBV is different from a dBu, but they both are called dBs. Hopefully that helps ground you a little bit. I know some of this can be confusing, but that's my attempt to try to help you understand how these things can be all called dBs, but yet have different values. Okay, so here we go. Okay, dBV, voltage. You may have heard of it, you might see it somewhere, but for the most part, we won't be using that in recording in a digital audio workstation, so we can forget about that. dBu, however, is important because it's relative to the analog side of the equation, meaning your microphone or guitar pickup being fed into a preamp into your DAW. So dBu is important, and we'll be using that. dBW, as far as I know, we'll never use that, so we can just forget it. Now, remember when I talked about the dB being a way to evaluate electricity flowing across telephone lines? Well, that initially was called a dBm, and it had a very precise calculations about voltage and resistance over the length of a cable. So even though that's important, we're not going to be typically using that in our digital recordings. Next, dBSPL. That's important because that's important on the front end and the back end of what we're doing. On the front end, it's the volume from the source we're trying to capture. Let's say it's a singer singing very quiet, so they would have a low SPL or sound pressure level. It might be a snare drum hitting with a high SPL. So that's on the input side. Then after we get done recording, mixing, and putting our music out for somebody to listen to, it's got to come out of a speaker, and the volume, the SPL, becomes important there as how loud is that sound in the room. Okay, so we will use that. It's very important. Next, dBVU. dBVU. That was invented in the days when all of the recording was done in the analog domain prior to digital, and the dBVU meter was created to help the engineers achieve a good signal strength. We may or may not use that, so I'm going to leave it on the list and I'll talk about it. And last is dBFS, or full scale, and that's what we use in the digital audio system. So that's very important. All of the meters we're working with in the digital audio system are going to be referenced to the dB full scale. Okay, now that we have a little history and we have a very basic technical understanding of decibels, from my perspective, it's really just a bunch of history and a bunch of numbers that I have difficulty equating to and putting into practice unless I start understanding how this is applied in a real-life practical situation. So that's what I'm going to try to do in this segment of the video. Let's talk about a typical analog recording situation. In all instances, we start with a sound source, a drum, a vocalist, a guitar, for that matter, any instrument. And when it comes to a drum or a vocalist or most instruments, they are generating a sound wave which is measured in SPL, sound pressure levels. Quiet sound, low SPL, louder sound, high SPL. And when that flows through the air, it hits the microphone, which has a capsule in it, and that capsule hears the sound, makes the diaphragm in that capsule move through a magnetic field, and it generates a teeny tiny little bit of electricity. It's measured in millivolts. That, in turn, goes into some sort of preamp, which was typically housed in a recording console. And that preamp amplified that teeny tiny little signal with enough voltage so that it then could be processed through the analog console's EQ or compressors and so on and so forth, and then spit out and recorded on a tape recording machine. That then in turn was sent to what is called a master. And that's where the term mastering comes in audio recording. That was handed off to an individual who actually converted that sound coming from the tape into a machine that cut the grooves into what is referred to as a master disc. Once that disc was created, all of the subsequent copies of the disc, the vinyl records that you would buy and would be distributed, were made from that master disc. So if you bought the record, you put it on a record player, that came out of a speaker, and guess what? That sound was measured in SPLs again. Low volume, high volume, low SPL, high SPL. That in turn might have been played by a disc jockey at a radio station, which converted that again into voltage and then sent it out for broadcast out to all the radios across the world. Now let's just go back upstream a little bit to an electric guitar. Now, electric guitar has a pickup in it, which is called a transducer, and it doesn't have a diaphragm that moves. What happens is the mechanism is the metal strings are moving in front of a magnet in the pickup, and that is creating that teeny tiny little bit of voltage. In all cases, we're talking about voltage flowing through the system. Hey, before we leave this section, just a couple of fun facts. A dynamic microphone, for all practical purposes, is just like a speaker, but in reverse. A speaker gets an electrical impulse. The magnet causes the speaker cone to vibrate, and it creates a sound. Turn that around, and the sound comes at the diaphragm, makes it move, and that in turn puts out electricity. Okay. As I mentioned, a dynamic microphone generates voltage that's teeny tiny, in the millionth of a volt. So, hey, think of it. Whether that microphone is plugged in and in use, sitting in a drawer, sitting on a tabletop, or in your pocket, it is always generating a small amount of electricity. Anytime a sound hits that microphone, it's creating a little teeny tiny bit of electricity. Who knows? Someday we might tear down the solar panels on our roofs and put up a couple 100 million microphones to power our homes. Kind of weird, but I thought it was fun. Okay, so let's get back to the practical application. Let's remember that the only time we're actually measuring sound is way at the beginning from the source, and way at the end when it comes out of a speaker, we're measuring the volume in dB SPL, sound pressure level. Everything in the middle as it flows through the recording system is measured in voltage in dBu, which I believe is called decibels unreferenced. Too complicated to explain that. So we got sound at the beginning, sound at the end, voltage in the middle. Okay, so we need voltage flowing through this system, this analog recording system, and the minimum amount required is 0.775 volts, which equals 0 dBu. Okay, that makes the system work. However, the recording engineers came to realize that that wasn't quite enough voltage to deliver a quality recording. In part because every recording has got a little bit of system noise in it. It might be from the preamp. It might be from the tubes they were using. It might be from the microphone. So there's a certain amount of signal noise baked into every recording, and they wanted to record their source at a much higher level so that when it was played back, you didn't hear that low-level noise. So what did they do? They invented the VU meter. And they calibrated that at a higher voltage. The minimum to make this thing work was 0.775 volts, but they knew they needed more. So they upped it to 1.23 volts. Okay, so 1.23 volts was called plus 4 dBu. And that's what they wanted to use to do their recordings. So, at that point, they decided to create a meter to help manage that, and that was called the VU meter. So they took that 1.23 volts, they created a meter that would read that voltage, and they set that VU meter so that 1.23 volts, or plus 4 dB, was 0 on the VU meter. So now they have a meter called the VU meter, and 0 is where they want to try to be all the time. And it's okay if you go a little bit above. You're going to get some what they call harmonic distortion. But they never want to fall too far below 0, because that's where the recorded signal starts to get lower and lower to the point where it's close to the inherent noise in the system, and that's no good. So they adopted using the VU meter when recording in the analog environment. Well, that wraps up analog recording, but how does that transfer into the digital recording world that we work in today? Let's do a brief review. The sound source is the same. It emits SPLs. The microphone, the pickups, everything. It's generating a little bit of electricity and it goes into a preamp. Now, here's where things start to change. The preamp used to be housed in a console. Now it's typically housed in a audio interface. But not only does the audio interface amplify that tiny voltage, but it also converts the analog signal to a digital signal. And that's where the world starts to change. Now, we can't forget about this analog side because it still has relevance today. We're still going to have a sound source. We're still going to have a capture device. We still need a preamp. And that's going to be measured in dBu, which is measuring voltage. But then once it gets into the audio interface, it is converted into digital. And then you'll hear the term A to D, which means audio to digital conversion. But it also has to be able to do it the other way around. Once it creates a digital file, it needs to be converted back to audio so we can send it out to a speaker. So the conversion inside of a audio interface is often referred to as A to D / D to A, because it converts both ways. So once we convert it, it goes into the computer where we have a DAW, in this case Studio One. And again, the mixing console is replaced with a digital mixing console, and we no longer put out a record. What we're doing now is putting out a digital file, typically a WAV or an MP3 file, and the radio tower is now replaced with a digital transmission over perhaps a cell phone network, and then when it is received by the end user, maybe on a smartphone, it's played through headphones, and guess what? Here again is where we start to be concerned about SPL. How loud are those cell phones in your, how loud is that headphone playing in your ears? So we're going to walk through this a little more. Okay, so before we leave this portion of the video, I want to leave you with this very important concept. Everything coming into your interface is measured in dBu, which is voltage, and once it gets into the interface and it's converted, it's going to be measured in dBFS, or dB full scale. That's critical. And hopefully now you'll understand why I spent so much time on the analog side, because it does feed in to the digital side, and we need to blend those two and work across both analog and digital to put out a good audio recording. I think it's time now to dive a little into a term called gain staging. And we have some understanding now of what these meters are displaying, what they're reading. Later on in the video, we're going to get into the DAW, and I'll demonstrate the actual use and how the signal flows through them, and I'll make some recommendations on settings. But all through the path, every time something hits an amplifier that either dials up the voltage or dials up the dBFS, we are changing the gain of that signal. And our goal ultimately is to have a nice, clean, well-recorded piece of audio. And if we mess up the gain stage anywhere along the line, our results are not going to be favorable. And the more we understand how to use the gain staging properly, we have a much better chance of getting a high-quality recording when we're done. Let's stop. Let's stop right here and let this concept sink in. Think about it, write it down, or come back to this video to remember. We have two phases of recording. One is input, and that's called gain, and the other is output, and that's called volume. All of the faders on your DAW system, anytime you're in the mixer in the DAW, all of those faders are only controlling one thing: output. Whether it's the individual channel outputting to the main, or perhaps you're taking individual channels and sending them to a bus. In that case, the bus fader is managing output, and that all rolls up to the main out, and that's where you control the volume of your total mix. Remember, all of the faders in your DAW mixer are not controlling input, which is called gain. They are only controlling output, which is called volume. Let's dive into that a little bit. We talk a lot about mixing. That's a combination of skill and creativity. We manipulate what we want to put out. But gain staging, that's a technical requirement. And improper gain staging will ruin your mix.
Huh?
That's right. Most mixes are ruined by improper gain staging. How do we avoid that? Well, I think it's time to jump into the DAW. Thanks for sticking with me this far. Hope you found some of this information helpful. I've got a lot more in-depth information in the second in this series, and then one more combination of 3 videos on this topic in this series. I hope to see you in the next one. In the meantime, I'd very much appreciate it if you would subscribe to my channel. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Please like and subscribe. And if you think there's any value in anything I've provided here and you want to show your appreciation, consider buying me a coffee. I've got the link below. Thanks again. See you in the next video.